Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when royal bloodlines were treated like a very confused family puzzle. So, go ahead and dim the lights, settle into whatever blanket situation you've constructed, and let your brain go pleasantly offline for a while. Because this evening, we're exploring something wonderfully calm, gently ridiculous, and historically inevitable. The many, many ways royal families manage to make their own lives worse through marriages, alliances, and genetics that, how do we say this kindly, did not age well. Just let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. And let me do what generations of medieval monarchs could not. Provide a peaceful, stable environment. Tonight's slow drift through history begins with a simple idea: when you only marry your cousins, eventually your family tree looks less like a tree and more like a half-collapsed coat rack. So, let's settle in. Let's float back through the candlelit corridors. And let's start with the first gentle disaster. Chapter 1: The Quiet Art of Royal Genetic Chaos. Royal families love two things: power and, well, more power. And because they believed no one outside the family could be trusted with that power, they kept handing it to each other like a warm potato at a medieval family reunion. The result? A centuries-long group project in hereditary roulette. Let's glide into one of the classics. The House of Habsburg. A dynasty so committed to keeping their bloodline pure that it eventually looped around and achieved something closer to structural failure. Their motto could have been, "Sure, that cousin looks healthy enough," followed by several hundred years of medical evidence that, no, in fact, he did not. Imagine a royal portrait gallery. Golden frames. Velvet drapes. And a long corridor of faces gradually collapsing inward like warm bread dough. That's essentially the Habsburgs. But let's ease into this gently. Chapter 2: Charles II, the sleepiest catastrophe of them all. Our first slow-motion royal fiasco tonight is Charles II of Spain. Often called Charles the Bewitched, which wasn't meant affectionately. Although, to be fair, most nicknames created by terrified courtiers rarely are. Charles II is probably the softest, saddest symbol of what happens when a family decides that marrying outside the dynasty is an optional hobby. He was the product of 16 generations of intra-family recycling. Imagine if your family tree had only 5 branches, and everyone kept sitting on them. But let's take this slowly. Charles was born in 1661. He entered the world with the genetic equivalent of a dozen contradictory user manuals. His jaw was famously enormous, so enormous that he struggled to chew. People called it the Habsburg jaw, but honestly, it deserves its own credit line at this point. His tongue was too big for normal speech. His eyesight wobbled. His spine protested constantly. And his immune system, well, it took the medieval equivalent of personal days. Frequently. Yet despite all this, Charles was the king of Spain. A vast empire. And you can picture him sitting on the throne, looking vaguely confused by the entire situation, as if he'd just woken up from a nap and wasn't entirely sure why the room was full of diplomats. His doctors kept writing increasingly creative diagnoses. One blamed bewitchment. Another blamed melancholic vapors. Not one of them wrote down the obvious: maybe we should consider marrying outside the family. But even in his fragile state, Charles had responsibilities. He had to produce an heir. This was optimistic. His first marriage produced nothing. His second marriage also produced nothing. His body simply wasn't interested in participating in the continuation of the Spanish monarchy. By the end of his life, Charles looked exhausted by several centuries of family decisions he did not personally make. And when he died in 1700, at the age of only 38, he effectively ended the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. The dynasty just folded like an overused bedsheet. His death also started a massive European war, because of course it did. Royal families rarely do anything quietly. But we're staying calm. We're staying sleepy. We're drifting on. Let's slide gently to the next royal mishap. Chapter 3: The Maximilian Problem. Too many cousins, not enough variety. Before Charles II, there was Maximilian I, the man who set the Habsburgs on their famous genetic path with the motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." A sweet idea. Very peaceful. Very wholesome. Except, they married each other. Repeatedly. With enthusiasm. Maximilian wasn't trying to create genetic entropy. He just wanted political stability. And he accidentally created Charles II in the process. But that's how dynasties work. One man signs a treaty, his great-great-great-great-grandson ends up with a jaw so monumental it becomes a case study in every genetics class. It's a long arc. A very unfortunate arc. Let's float away from that corridor of cousins for now. Let's drift toward another monarch whose bloodline took some questionable turns. Chapter 4, The Lovely, Limping Lancasters. Next, we wander softly over to England. To the Wars of the Roses. A conflict so dramatic that it's almost soothing in hindsight, because at least we're not living through it. Here we find Henry VI. A man who probably should not have been king, or commander, or decision-maker of any kind. But, as usual, royal birth had other plans. Henry VI was gentle. Quiet. More contemplative than a monk staring at a wall. He wasn't built for political chaos. And he certainly wasn't prepared for hereditary mental illness that drifted through the Lancastrian line like a slow fog. By the time he reached adulthood, Henry had long, solemn episodes of catatonia. He would sit still for days. Not aggressive. Not alarming. Just, quietly unresponsive to every crisis around him. At one point, the royal court tried informing him that his wife had given birth to a son. He said nothing. Not a blink. Months later, he suddenly returned, looked at his baby, and said something like, "Oh. A child?" Which the nobles considered progress. Henry's condition was likely inherited. A mix of genetic depression, possibly schizophrenia, and a family tendency to implode under pressure. It was a rough combination. While Henry was lost in mental fog, England tore itself apart. Which, historically speaking, is something England often did without hesitation. But let's keep ourselves calm. Let's keep the history soft and slow. Because this story isn't about battles, it's about the quiet unraveling of a mind in a dynasty already stretched thin. When Henry was finally deposed, then restored, then deposed again, it became clear that his bloodline was not going to produce a stable monarchy. But that's the beauty of bedtime history. We don't need to rush. We don't need to solve anything. We just drift over to the next monarch in our gentle parade of genetic misadventures. Let's settle back in. Let your shoulders soften again. And let's continue our slow, peaceful wander through the strange personal lives of people who absolutely should not have been in charge of entire kingdoms. We're drifting now into an area I like to call the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. A soothing little collection of monarchs who treated ruling like an oddly competitive board game, even though most of them barely had the emotional maturity of a sleepy houseplant. Nothing intense, nothing scary. Just gentle incompetence. The kind that's perfect for bedtime. Chapter 5, Charles VI of France, the king who forgot he was a king. Let's start with a soft one. A king who, much like many of us, occasionally forgot who he was and what he was doing. Charles VI of France. A man so genetically doomed that his reign reads like a medical case study written by a doctor who kept sighing between paragraphs. Charles began promisingly. Sharp. Well-liked. Stable. And then, around age 24, his mind simply decided to take a long and largely permanent vacation. His episodes were calm at first. Moments of confusion. A little dissociation. Mild paranoia. You know, the usual royal stress symptoms. But things escalated into something far more mesmerizing. A gentle favorite of historians is his belief that he was made of glass. He truly thought that if someone bumped into him, he would shatter. So he refused to let people touch him. He reinforced his clothes. And he sat extremely still, like a very depressed chandelier. This wasn't his only delusion. At one point, Charles simply forgot his own name. His wife entered the room. He stared at her blankly. And after a long pause, he reportedly said, "Who are you? What business have you here?" Not hostile. Just politely confused. His court was built on fragile alliances, fragile politics, and, quite fittingly, an extremely fragile king. Of course, all of this was genetically fueled. The Valois family tree had more cousin loops than a medieval racetrack. But don't worry. We're staying calm. It's bedtime. And Charles VI is one of the most relaxing royal disasters to fall asleep to. Let's drift on. Chapter 6, Joanna of Castile, the Queen of Slowly Coming Undone. Next, let's glide over to Spain again. To Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad. Which is a bit rude, and historically exaggerated, but nevertheless a clue that her life was slightly more complicated than a typical royal itinerary. Joanna wasn't born unstable. She was born into, well, Habsburg territory. The genetics alone were already standing ominously behind her shoulder. But her true unraveling came from heartbreak, stress, political manipulation, and a husband who behaved exactly like the kind of man you should not marry if your family already has a history of mental illness. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was in fact handsome, if your definition of handsome includes a man who thinks every mirror is an opportunity to admire himself. Joanna adored him. Philip adored himself. He cheated constantly. Openly. Repetitively. He treated her emotions like something he'd accidentally spilled on his shoes. And Joanna, who was young, isolated, and already carrying the Habsburg genetic starter pack, slowly unraveled. After Philip died, some say from illness, some say from karma, Joanna became consumed with grief. She traveled with his coffin. Refused to bury him. And whispered to the embalmed face at night. Not horrifying. Just deeply sad. A quiet collapse. Her father eventually locked her away. 4 decades. She wasn't allowed to rule. She wasn't allowed out. Her mind drifted into long, silent corridors. And the crown went to the next generation of Habsburgs, because apparently the dynasty had not yet learned anything from its own behavior. But don't worry. We're still in a peaceful, sleepy place. Joanna's story is tragic, but calm, a slow unraveling in a very echoey castle. Let's drift onward. Chapter 7, Christian VII of Denmark, a king who needed a nap, a therapist, and several vacations. Now we float to Denmark. To Christian VII, a textbook case of what happens when royal genetics meet childhood neglect, zero boundaries, and the perpetual panic of being expected to rule a country while barely understanding breakfast. Christian VII was anxious. Jittery. Emotionally fragile. Easily overwhelmed. And deeply confused by most adult responsibilities. His symptoms, likely schizophrenia, likely inherited, became more pronounced as he aged. He fidgeted constantly. He rambled. He laughed at nothing. He stayed awake for days. Then collapsed into exhaustion. His court tried everything except compassion. They scolded him. Mocked him. Locked him away during episodes. Which, shockingly, did not improve matters. Eventually, the real governing power fell to his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee, who became extremely influential. Possibly too influential. Possibly romantically involved with Christian's wife. Possibly exactly the kind of political drama that Christian was not emotionally equipped to handle. The whole situation ended with executions, arrests, and a quiet, confused monarch who simply wanted to be left alone with his thoughts, which were already more than enough to manage. But we're drifting. Floating. Staying calm. Because even dysfunctional monarchs can be soothing when viewed from a very safe distance. Let's glide onward. Welcome back. If you've got a blanket or pillow, give it a little adjustment. Make sure the lights are low. We're about to wander through the early years of kings and queens who, spoiler alert, probably wished someone had invented nap time and therapy in the 14th century. Because in medieval Europe, royal children were rarely allowed to be children. They were symbols, chess pieces, and sometimes experiments in heredity. And, as always, genetics and bad parenting made sure the results were interesting. Chapter 8, Edward VI of England, a tiny king with big problems. Let's start softly in England. With Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. A boy king, ascending the throne at age 9. Imagine a 9-year-old having to run a country. And try not to shudder. It's relaxing if we keep the distance. Edward was small, frail, and unusually intelligent. A lover of books. A careful thinker. Unfortunately, also a child caught in the storm of Tudor ambition, religious upheaval, and court intrigue. He got sick often. Which is polite English for he nearly died several times. Medical care being what it was, the boy spent a great deal of his life in bed, being examined by doctors who were mostly guessing. Despite all this, he ruled wisely, if briefly, showing more calm judgment than most of his adult advisors. Sadly, he died at 15, exhausted by disease, stress, and perhaps an early onset of malnutrition. A sad story. But soft. A gentle reminder that even the tiniest kings carried enormous crowns. Chapter 9, Mary, Queen of Scots, Childhood Under Surveillance. Now let's drift to Scotland. To Mary Stuart, whose life began with a kind of quiet oppression perfect for bedtime listening. Mary became queen as an infant. Raised mostly by nobles and governesses, because royal parents were busy, distracted, or conveniently dead. Which is historically common. She was educated in languages, music, and courtly etiquette. But also under constant scrutiny. Every movement observed. Every word recorded. Every sneeze noted in court diaries. You can imagine a young child tiptoeing through corridors of polished stone, feeling watched, feeling isolated, and perhaps quietly wondering why adults found her existence so fascinating. Mary's early life was quiet, sad, and slightly surreal. Exactly the kind of thing that makes a story perfect for lulling you into a soft, slow sleep. Chapter 10, Louis XIV, the Sun King starts in shadows. Now, gentle viewers, we drift toward France. To Louis XIV, whose legendary reign began in a nursery. The Sun King was not born glowing. He was a fragile infant. Sickly. And heavily pampered. His childhood was carefully controlled, no roughhousing, no dirty fingernails, no inconvenient illnesses that couldn't be tended to by royal nurses and wet nurses. The irony is that his careful upbringing, designed to protect him, may have also contributed to his famous obsession with control later in life. From the very start, Louis was learning, the world is something to be managed, gently, meticulously, preferably from a distance. He grew tall, strong, and dangerously confident, exactly as intended by his caretakers, though perhaps a little more rigid than strictly necessary. Still, imagine him as a small child, swaddled, watched, fed, and slowly building the habits that would one day dominate Versailles. A calming image, really, in its own aristocratic way. Chapter 11, The Sickly Habsburg Infants. Finally, let's drift back toward Spain and the Habsburgs. A dynasty with a long-standing reputation for producing children who were small, frail, and genetically challenged. Many Habsburg princes and princesses died young. Some survived but carried lifelong health problems. Others were adored by doting parents but handled like porcelain dolls, never allowed to run or play for fear of breaking. Imagine the nursery. Soft rugs, heavy curtains, endless layers of velvet. Toys carefully selected. Food strictly measured. Children growing under the gaze of endless medical advice, much of it nonsense, much of it gentle, and all of it very exhausting. It's the perfect combination for bedtime listening, small, fragile children, surrounded by opulence and concern, drifting in rooms full of candlelight, completely oblivious to the chaos outside. Welcome back. Adjust your pillow. Let your body sink into whatever soft surface you've claimed. We're about to wander through centuries of marital arrangements that were legally sound, politically clever, and personally disastrous. Remember, the goal tonight is calm, not horror. These are stories of mild genetic misfortune, odd personal quirks, and gentle familial chaos. Chapter 12, The Habsburg Lips and the Repetition of Error. Let's begin softly with the Habsburgs, who appear again, not out of spite, but because they provide the most consistent example of dynastic repetition. By the 16th century, they had discovered a kind of family hobby, marrying cousins. Again and again. Like a slow, persistent drumbeat. One of the most famous side effects was the Habsburg jaw. Pronounced, protruding, slightly comical. Yet fully consistent across generations. Consider Philip II of Spain, son of Charles V. He married his niece, Anne of Austria. Yes. His niece. A political alliance, yes. A genetic headache, quietly guaranteed, yes. Their children included Don Carlos, a sensitive and unstable boy who spent much of his adolescence locked in rooms, pacing, and writing desperate letters. Philip's solution? Not therapy. Not a change in marriage plans. Just a continuation of the same slow, predictable dynasty experiment. And so the Habsburgs continued, producing heirs who were often sickly, sometimes mentally fragile, and always slightly surprising in their combination of physical and behavioral quirks. It's a remarkable kind of gently tragic continuity. Perfect for bedtime reflection. Chapter 13, The Tudors and the Peril of Political Love. Now, drift softly over to England. To the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII, a king famous for being tall, imposing, and difficult, married 6 times. Each marriage brought its own quiet disasters, some political, some personal, and all ultimately very British in their awkward execution. Consider Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife. She produced the much-loved Edward VI, but tragically died shortly after childbirth. And yet, the cycle of replacement continued, with Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, all subtly reflecting the tension between dynastic need and personal incompatibility. Henry's marriages were polite disasters. No one shouted. No one needed swords immediately, usually. Just a slow, methodical reshuffling of alliances, heirs, and occasionally executed spouses. Which is a calm, almost hypnotic pattern in retrospect. Chapter 14, Mary I and Philip II, a politically arranged, emotionally tepid match. Back to Spain and England again. Mary I of England, the so-called Bloody Mary, married Philip II of Spain. Philip, cautious and polite, rarely raised his voice. Mary, deeply passionate about her religion, did raise hers, but generally in calm, measured tones by historical standards. The marriage was politically brilliant. It was personally underwhelming. No great affection bloomed. No joy. Just a gentle coexistence under royal expectations. Mary became Queen of England in 1553, Philip never fully integrated into English life, and the entire arrangement quietly produced no surviving children. Perfectly soothing if you like your history calm, dry, and without melodrama. Chapter 15, The Bourbon repeats the Habsburg pattern. Drifting south to France, the Bourbons inherited a pattern similar to the Habsburgs, albeit slightly more robust. Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain, consolidating power while doubling down on potential genetic stress. Their children were many. Most survived infancy, but several carried fragile constitutions. One could imagine them toddling through Versailles corridors, already imbibing lessons in pomp, obligation, and gentle illness. Louis XIV, of course, remained gloriously oblivious to the subtle genetic consequences of his marital choices. His focus was on courtly display, elaborate etiquette, and a certain sun-inspired self-importance. The children quietly absorbed their destinies, just as the Habsburgs had. Chapter 16, The Calm Disaster of the Medici Marriages. Finally, a drift into Italy, with the Medici family. The Medicis were sophisticated, politically cunning, and financially powerful. They also had a habit of marrying cousins or close allies. The consequences were less dramatic than the Habsburg jaw, but more subtle. Children prone to mild illness, fragile marriages, and occasional quiet scandals in Florence. A notable example, Marie de Medici married Henry IV of France. A political alliance. She struggled personally, navigating court intrigue and her own insecurities. The marriage produced several children, some healthy, some ill, but all quietly demonstrating the subtle consequences of dynastic repetition. Welcome back. Adjust your blanket. Take a slow breath. We're about to drift into the small bedrooms, nurseries, and childhood chambers of European royalty. A world of velvet, candlelight, and quiet fragility. These are children raised to carry crowns before they could even walk. Children whose lives were carefully controlled, and often quietly disastrous. Chapter 17, The Young Louis XV, Childhood Under Surveillance. Let's start softly with Louis XV of France, known later as the Well-Beloved. Louis became king at 5, which, unsurprisingly, is extremely young to rule a kingdom. His upbringing was carefully monitored. Every meal, every step, every word supervised by regents, governesses, and nervous courtiers. He was small, delicate, and prone to illness. The court's solution? Surround him with layers of silk and warm blankets. Keep him upright. Keep him fed. And quietly hope he survives long enough to carry the dynasty forward. In private, Louis XV was timid and shy. A child tiptoeing through corridors of velvet drapes, afraid to sneeze too loudly. Perfectly soothing imagery for bedtime. Chapter 18, Prince John of England, A Life Cut Short. Drifting back to England, we meet Prince John, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. John was sickly from birth. He had epilepsy and developmental delays. He lived in the shadow of his older siblings and the intense concern of his family. He spent much of his life quietly at home, away from public life, under constant care. Not dramatic. Not dangerous. Just quietly fragile. A small life lived softly, carefully, and largely unnoticed by history until we look back. His story reminds us that sometimes royal life was not about power or intrigue. Sometimes it was simply about surviving each day, quietly. Chapter 19, Maria Theresa's Children, Education Meets Overprotection. Back in Austria, Maria Theresa of Austria raised 16 children. 16. Which, even in royal terms, is quite a few. Her children were carefully instructed in languages, etiquette, religion, and politics. And also carefully shielded from danger, risk, and spontaneous fun. Many were sickly as infants. Many carried minor physical or psychological frailties. Yet each was meticulously guided toward dynastic marriage plans and political alliances. Imagine a corridor of children, all in velvet, walking quietly behind their mother, their steps measured, their voices polite. A serene, oddly hypnotic scene, perfect for bedtime. Chapter 20, Charles IX of France, Fragile Health, Strong Expectations. Charles IX became king at 10. Already a frail boy, with delicate health. He was surrounded by nobles and advisors who were often more interested in manipulating him than protecting him. He suffered from constant illness, anxiety, and the pressure of a kingdom embroiled in religious conflict. Yet his childhood remains quietly sad rather than dramatic. A boy navigating a royal maze, hoping his body holds up long enough to meet the expectations placed upon him. Chapter 21, Elizabeth I, Delicate Child, Iron Crown. Even the famous Elizabeth I began as a frail, small child. Daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, she survived the dangerous Tudor court largely by cleverness and caution. Her early life was full of quiet tension, whispered court politics, and long periods of observation. She learned early that being small and delicate was no excuse for poor decision-making. And perhaps it was this gentle, careful childhood that allowed her to become the formidable, composed monarch she would later be. Welcome back. Adjust your pillow one last time. Breathe slowly. We're about to drift through the final corridors of European royalty, where fragile children became fragile adults, where marriages repeated quietly, and where history's patterns repeat like soft echoes in a vast, empty palace. Chapter 22, Charles II of England, the merry but frail Restoration King. Returning to England, let's briefly visit Charles II, a monarch both beloved and personally vulnerable. Charles survived the chaos of civil war and exile. He returned to rule a kingdom tired of conflict. He was charming, witty, and genetically fragile. Health issues lingered throughout his life. Yet he maintained a calm composure, a witty demeanor, and an almost hypnotic capacity to survive the pressures of monarchy. Charles II reminds us that even in dynastic fragility, some royals carried themselves with quiet, resilient grace. Perfect for bedtime meditation, a soft reminder that survival itself can be elegant. Chapter 23, The Spanish Habsburgs, Patterns Repeated, Softly Observed. Let's drift back to Spain, where the Habsburgs quietly continued their experiments in family repetition. They married cousins. They produced frail children. They created Charles II. And then they repeated history in small ways. Not out of malice, not out of cruelty, just adherence to dynastic rules, tradition, and a gentle obsession with family continuity. From a distance, it's a calming spectacle. A dynasty unfolding like a slow, repetitive, softly tragic pattern, perfect for letting the mind drift. Chapter 24, Gentle Lessons from Fragile Thrones. If there's a lesson in tonight's slow drift through royal history, it is simply this. Genetics matter. Overprotection has subtle consequences. And marrying your cousin repeatedly will almost always end in minor, sleepy disasters. The grand narrative of monarchy is not always thrilling. It is soft, quietly tragic, and deeply repetitive. It is corridors of velvet, children who can barely walk, fragile kings who cannot chew, queens quietly unraveling in candlelit rooms. And, strangely enough, it's perfect for bedtime. Chapter 25, Final Drift, Royals as a Gentle Lullaby. As we conclude, imagine the scene. A corridor of portraits. Gilded frames. Velvet curtains swaying softly in a gentle breeze. Each monarch staring back, fragile, spoiled, confused, or delicate. Some died young. Some survived. All left small, quiet imprints on the long tapestry of history. And we have drifted through their lives tonight. Softly. Calmly. With gentle sarcasm and understated humor, but always at a slow, lulling pace. Let your thoughts settle on the gentle absurdity of dynastic Europe. The endless loops of inbreeding, the soft sadness of spoiled children, the quiet mismanagement of entire kingdoms. All harmless now. All comfortably distant. Take a deep breath. Exhale slowly. Let the images fade. Let the candlelight dim. And drift fully into sleep. Good night. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of velvet corridors, candlelight, and monarchs whose lives were, in every way, both carefully arranged and quietly disastrous. So go ahead, dim the lights. Nestle under a blanket, or pile some pillows if that's your style. Take a slow breath in, and let it out even more slowly. Tonight, we're exploring a version of history that's soothing, ironic, and just a little absurd. We'll be gliding through European royal marriages gone horribly, genetically wrong, lingering on the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens, and peaking at sickly, spoiled, and quietly tragic royal childhoods. This is not a story of battles and bloody conquest. It is a story of fragile people, odd family patterns, and gentle calamities, perfect for letting your mind drift. Chapter 1, The Calm Chaos of Royal Genetics. Royal families loved two things, power and, well, more power. They believed outsiders were inherently suspicious. The easiest solution? Marry their cousins. Repeatedly. Patiently. Almost obsessively. The result, of course, was a slow-motion disaster in heredity. Some generations produced charming rulers. Others produced Charles II of Spain. He was a man whose jaw has its own chapter in medical textbooks. He struggled to chew. he struggled to walk. And he struggled to survive the genetic experiment his family had quietly perfected over centuries. Yet despite all this, he became king of Spain, a vast empire. He sat on the throne looking like he had just woken from a nap and discovered politics was optional. His doctors debated whether he was bewitched. None suggested marrying outside the family. Naturally, that made everything worse. And so the Habsburgs continued, calm, careful, and relentlessly inbred. Chapter 2, Charles II, the sleepiest catastrophe of them all. Charles II, the Bewitched, is the poster child for gentle, genetic failure. He was weak. He was frail. He was not an ideal physical specimen. His body resisted producing heirs. His tongue was too large for speech. His jaw was immense. And yet, he ruled. He sat in the Spanish court, surrounded by advisors, diplomats, and endless corridors, quietly failing to chew, speak, and reproduce. When he died at 38, he ended the Spanish Habsburg line. Europe responded with a polite panic known as the War of Spanish Succession. But we are calm. We are sleepy. We are drifting. Chapter 3, The Maximilian Problem, Too Many Cousins, Not Enough Variety. Maximilian I of Austria deserves a slow, soft mention here. He married strategically. He married familiarly. And, in doing so, created a dynastic pattern that would haunt Europe for centuries. The lesson? If you only marry cousins, eventually your family tree loops back on itself like a quietly confused racetrack. The results were predictable. Fragile children, confused monarchs, and the occasional political crisis. Nothing dramatic. Just the gentle erosion of vitality across generations. Chapter 4, The Lancasters, Quietly Losing Their Minds. Let's drift softly to England. Henry VI, a Lancastrian king, was unusually contemplative. Perhaps too contemplative. He experienced long periods of mental fog. He sometimes forgot he was king. He would sit, motionless, as crises unfolded around him. Not dramatic. Not scary. Just calm, quiet, and slightly tragic. When he returned from these episodes, he would politely inquire about events that had passed weeks earlier. His nobles considered this progress. We consider it bedtime material. Chapter 5, The Calm Disaster of Royal Childhoods. Children of royals had no normal childhood. They were symbols. Chess pieces. Experiments in heredity. Edward VI of England became king at 9. He was small, intelligent, and frequently ill. Doctors guessed at diagnoses, nurses fussed, and the court whispered. He died at 15. Quietly, gently, as fragile children often did. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her early years under constant surveillance. Elizabeth I was frail, shy, and meticulously observed. Louis XIV, the Sun King, learned control and discipline before he could walk. Their lives were soft, constrained, and oddly hypnotic. Perfect for bedtime. Welcome back. Adjust your blanket, settle your shoulders, and let your eyes soften. We're about to wander through the lives of monarchs who were, in their own quiet ways, petty, fragile, or mildly absurd. Not dramatic. Not terrifying. Just gently disastrous. Chapter 6, Charles VI of France, the king who thought he was glass. Charles VI, also known as Charles the Beloved, though historians might argue about the beloved part, was a man of gentle instability. He suffered from mental illness that started in his mid-20s. Initially, small episodes of confusion. Later, complete delusions. He believed he was made of glass. If someone bumped into him, he feared he would shatter. The court adapted by softening every surface, padding corridors, and watching him tiptoe through Versailles like a cautious porcelain doll. Not dramatic. Not horrifying. Perfectly hypnotic for bedtime. Chapter 7, Joanna of Castile, Quietly Unraveling. Joanna of Castile, often called Joanna the Mad, had a similarly slow collapse. She adored her husband, Philip the Handsome, who, unfortunately, adored himself more. He cheated openly. She mourned deeply. After his death, she carried his coffin around Spain for years. A quiet, candlelit grief. Her father eventually locked her away. Decades passed. Joanna's life became a soft echo of sadness in palace corridors, with little action but much quiet despair. Chapter 8, Christian VII of Denmark, a nervous king. Christian VII was anxious, jittery, and overwhelmed by the simplest tasks. He fidgeted. He rambled. He occasionally went days without sleeping properly. The court tried interventions. Some mockery. Some confinement. Eventually, his physician became the de facto ruler. Christian was left mostly to his nervous pacing and occasional moments of clarity. From a distance, the whole situation is calming. A monarch quietly struggling with life while everyone else fussed around him. Chapter 9, More Gentle Observations. Across Europe, fragile monarchs were a recurring theme. Louis XIV's early childhood was carefully managed. Charles II of Spain spent much of his life frail and bewildered. Edward VI of England, tiny and intelligent, frequently sick. All of them lived lives that, from a safe distance, are oddly soothing. Slow-moving, repetitive patterns of fragility. Not exciting, not loud, but hypnotic in their quiet inevitability. Welcome back. Adjust your pillows. Take a slow breath. We're about to wander through nurseries, corridors, and candlelit rooms filled with fragile little royals. In medieval and early modern Europe, royal children were rarely children in the modern sense. They were symbols, dynastic pawns, and often experiments in heredity. The results were quietly disastrous. And somehow soothing to consider at bedtime. Chapter 10, Edward VI of England, the frail boy king. Edward VI became king at 9. He was small, intelligent, and frequently ill. His doctors guessed at diagnoses. He spent much of his childhood in bed or under careful supervision. Yet, remarkably, he ruled wisely. Briefly. And died at 15, exhausted by illness, stress, and the pressure of expectation. Imagine a tiny boy, surrounded by velvet, careful nurses, and endless advice. He tiptoes through courtly life, barely aware of the weight of a crown, and perfectly suited to lull us into a calm, sleepy reflection. Chapter 11, Mary, Queen of Scots, childhood under watchful eyes. Mary Stuart became queen as an infant. She was raised by nobles and governesses because her parents were busy or deceased. Every movement observed. Every word recorded. She learned languages, music, etiquette. And also learned that she was constantly being watched. Picture a small girl in long, flowing sleeves, walking carefully across cold stone floors, aware that every glance counts. Quietly tragic. Perfectly hypnotic. Chapter 12, Louis XIV, the Sun King begins in shadows. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was born fragile. Sickly, carefully swaddled, overprotected. His upbringing was regimented, no roughhousing, no danger, no unsupervised fun. He learned discipline before he could walk. Control before he could run. The Sun King's early life is a gentle illustration of how dynastic concern and overprotection shaped future rulers. Imagine him as a small child, swaddled, observed, and slowly learning the habits that would one day dominate Versailles. Hypnotic. Soft. Perfect for sleep. Chapter 13, Habsburg infants, fragility as tradition. Habsburg princes and princesses were often frail. Many died young. Some survived but carried lifelong health problems. Their nurseries were quiet and heavily supervised. Velvet, candles, soft rugs, and anxious caretakers everywhere. Every meal measured. Every movement monitored. Children growing in this way are oddly calming to imagine, delicate lives unfolding in softly lit corridors, completely detached from the outside chaos of dynastic politics. Welcome back. Adjust your blanket. Take a slow breath. We're about to wander through arranged marriages, quiet disasters, and dynastic repetition. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were about alliances, power, and genetics. And sometimes, they produced quietly disastrous results. Chapter 14, The Habsburg repeats the pattern. The Habsburgs loved cousins. Married cousins. Again and again. Philip II of Spain married his niece, Anne of Austria. Yes. His niece. Their children included Don Carlos, a sensitive and troubled boy. The Habsburg jaw, fragile health, and mild mental instability were the gentle consequences of dynastic repetition. Not dramatic. Not horrifying. Just quietly unfolding, like a slow, repetitive lullaby of genetics. Chapter 15, The Tudors, Polite Disasters. Henry VIII of England married 6 times. Each marriage brought its own subtle disasters. Jane Seymour produced Edward VI and then died shortly after childbirth. And of Cleves, well, Henry decided she wasn't attractive enough, politely divorced her, and she lived quietly. Catherine Howard was young, impulsive, and ultimately quietly executed. Catherine Parr survived and even outlived Henry. These were polite disasters. Repetitive, predictable, yet oddly calming. Chapter 16, Mary I and Philip II, Tepid Political Union. Mary I of England married Philip II of Spain. Philip was cautious and polite. Mary was deeply devoted to her religion. They were married politically, not romantically. The union produced no surviving children. A quiet, underwhelming failure. Yet from a distance, it is oddly hypnotic, 2 monarchs quietly coexisting under dynastic pressure. Chapter 17, The Bourbons and Medicis, Dynastic Echoes. Louis XIV of France married Maria Theresa of Spain. Their children were many, some fragile. The Bourbons quietly repeated the Habsburg pattern: strategic marriage, occasional frailty, polite dynastic disaster. The Medicis in Italy married cousins, produced sickly children, and quietly continued the same cycles of dynastic repetition. All of it soft, repetitive, and strangely soothing for bedtime listening. Welcome back. Adjust your pillow. Let your shoulders soften. We're returning to the small bedrooms, nurseries, and corridors of Europe's royal children, where the weight of a crown was often heavier than a child's body could bear. These were children born to dynasties obsessed with control, genetics, and appearances. Not exciting. Not dramatic. Just quietly fragile. Chapter 18, Louis XV, the Timid Young King. Louis XV became king at 5. He was small, frail, and constantly observed. Every movement recorded. Every meal measured. Every cough carefully noted. The court whispered about him endlessly. He learned to tiptoe through life, cautious of expectations. Imagine him walking softly through Versailles corridors, velvet drapes swaying, candles flickering, the weight of France pressing gently on his shoulders. A hypnotic, sleepy image. Chapter 19, Prince John of England, quietly fragile. Prince John, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, was sickly from birth. He had epilepsy and developmental delays. He lived mostly at home, under constant care, away from the public eye. Nothing dramatic happened. No battles. No intrigues. Just a quiet life of fragility, careful supervision, and occasional play. Perfect for bedtime reflection. Chapter 20, Maria Theresa's 16 children. Maria Theresa of Austria raised 16 children. Many were sickly. All were over-supervised. Her children learned etiquette, languages, music, and the subtle art of quiet compliance. They walked through candlelit corridors under the watchful eyes of governesses, tutors, and anxious mothers. It is a hypnotic scene, soft, slow-moving, and endlessly repetitive. Chapter 21, Charles IX of France, Fragile Health and Quiet Pressure. Charles IX became king at 10. He was frail, often sick, and constantly aware of courtly expectations. He tiptoed through his duties, quietly stressed by the political and religious pressures of France. From a distance, it is calm, almost hypnotic, a boy navigating a kingdom he is not entirely equipped to manage. Chapter 22, Elizabeth I, delicate child, formidable adult. Even Elizabeth I began as a frail child. Daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, she was observed, measured, and guided at every moment. Her childhood prepared her to survive the dangers of Tudor politics. Imagine a small, careful girl tiptoeing through corridors, learning patience, cunning, and composure. Soft. Quiet. Perfect for drifting into sleep. Welcome back. Adjust your blanket. Take a slow, deep breath. We're about to drift through the final corridors of European royalty, where fragility, overprotection, and dynastic repetition quietly dominated lives. Chapter 23, Charles II of England, charming but frail. Charles II was charming, witty, and genetically fragile. He survived civil war, exile, and political upheaval. His body, however, was delicate. He carried himself with calm grace. He navigated court intrigues with quiet humor. And despite his challenges, he lived long enough to leave a subtle mark on English history. From a distance, it's oddly soothing, a fragile king surviving the pressures of monarchy without fanfare or drama. Chapter 24, The Habsburgs, gentle repetition. The Habsburgs quietly repeated their dynastic patterns. Cousin marriages. Fragile children. The occasional mild disaster. Charles II of Spain was the culmination of this gentle, repeated experiment. His frailty, speech difficulties, and limited heirs were the quiet consequences of generations of careful inbreeding. It is hypnotic to imagine corridors lined with portraits of frail, delicately managed rulers, each generation echoing the previous one. Chapter 25, Patterns in Bourbon and Medici dynasties. The Bourbons, like the Habsburgs, continued the slow, repetitive patterns of dynastic management. Louis XIV's children were fragile, carefully observed, and slowly molded into the expectations of court life. The Medicis married strategically, producing children of varying health and temperament. Nothing dramatic. Just softly repeating cycles of control, fragility, and gentle chaos. Chapter 26, The Calm Lesson of Fragile Monarchs. If there is a lesson here, it is quietly philosophical. Genetics matters. Overprotection shapes personality. Political marriages rarely produce affection, often produce mild disasters. The corridors of palaces, the velvet-draped nurseries, the fragile heirs tiptoeing under watchful eyes, all of it forms a hypnotic pattern. Softly tragic, mildly absurd, and perfectly suited for sleep. Chapter 27, Final Drift, Royals as a Gentle Lullaby. Imagine the scene. Velvet curtains swaying in a gentle breeze. Candlelight flickering softly on gilded walls. Portraits of kings and queens staring back, fragile and careful. Children carefully guided, adults quietly struggling, dynasties repeating the same subtle errors. And now, we drift along with them. Let their quiet absurdity, gentle fragility, and endless repetition carry your mind into sleep. No urgency. No loud drama. Just soft, soothing history. Take a slow breath. Exhale slowly. Let the candlelight dim in your imagination. Let the soft, repetitive echoes of royal life lull you completely. Good night. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world of velvet corridors, candlelight, and monarchs whose lives were, in every way, both carefully arranged and quietly disastrous. The black screen means no harsh light to disturb you once you're finally dozing off. Go ahead, settle under a blanket, adjust your pillows, and allow your shoulders to soften. Take a slow breath in, and let it out even more slowly. Tonight, we'll explore European royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong, linger on the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens, and peek at sickly, spoiled, and quietly tragic royal childhoods. This is not a story of battles or bloody conquest. It is a story of fragile people, odd family patterns, and gentle calamities, perfect for letting your mind drift. Chapter 1: The Calm Chaos of Royal Genetics. Royal families loved two things: power and more power. They distrusted outsiders, naturally. The easiest solution? Marry their cousins. Repeatedly. Patiently. Almost obsessively. The result, of course, was a slow-motion disaster in heredity. Some generations produced charming rulers. Others produced Charles II of Spain. He was a man whose jaw has its own chapter in medical textbooks. He struggled to chew. He struggled to walk. And he struggled to survive the genetic experiment his family had quietly perfected over centuries. Yet despite all this, he became king of Spain. A vast empire. He sat on the throne looking like he had just woken from a nap and discovered politics was optional. His doctors debated whether he was bewitched. None suggested marrying outside the family. Naturally, that made everything worse. And so the Habsburgs continued, calm, careful, and relentlessly inbred. Chapter 2: Charles II, the sleepiest catastrophe of them all. Charles II, the bewitched, is the poster child for gentle, genetic failure. He was weak. He was frail. He was not an ideal physical specimen. His body resisted producing heirs. His tongue was too large for speech. His jaw was immense. And yet, he ruled. He sat in the Spanish court, surrounded by advisors, diplomats, and endless corridors, quietly failing to chew, speak, and reproduce. When he died at 38, he ended the Spanish Habsburg line. Europe responded with a polite panic known as the War of Spanish Succession. But we are calm. We are sleepy. We are drifting. Chapter 3: The Maximilian Problem. Too many cousins, not enough variety. Maximilian I of Austria deserves a slow, soft mention here. He married strategically. He married familiarly. And, in doing so, created a dynastic pattern that would haunt Europe for centuries. The lesson? If you only marry cousins, eventually your family tree loops back on itself like a quietly confused racetrack. The results were predictable. Fragile children, confused monarchs, and the occasional mild political crisis. Nothing dramatic. Just the gentle erosion of vitality across generations. Chapter 4: The Lancasters, quietly losing their minds. Let's drift softly to England. Henry VI, a Lancastrian king, was unusually contemplative. Perhaps too contemplative. He experienced long periods of mental fog. He sometimes forgot he was king. He would sit, motionless, as crises unfolded around him. Not dramatic. Not scary. Just calm, quiet, and slightly tragic. When he returned from these episodes, he would politely inquire about events that had passed weeks earlier. His nobles considered this progress. We consider it bedtime material. Chapter 5: The Calm Disaster of Royal Childhoods. Children of royals had no normal childhood. They were symbols. Chess pieces. Experiments in heredity. Edward VI of England became king at 9. He was small, intelligent, and frequently ill. Doctors guessed at diagnoses. He died at 15. Mary, Queen of Scots, spent her early years under constant surveillance. Elizabeth I was frail, shy, and meticulously observed. Louis XIV, the Sun King, learned control and discipline before he could walk. Their lives were soft, constrained, and oddly hypnotic. Perfect for bedtime.